Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session. You are in the Decarbonization Pathways for Existing Buildings in Los Angeles session. We're so glad to have you here. I'm sure folks are still circulating in here, but we do have a lot of content to cover today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I went ahead and posted something in the chat, so hopefully that has come through, but we've left time at the end of this presentation to have a Q&A session. So please do hold your questions until the end, but you can go ahead and send them through either via Zoom or the Wahoo app. So you don't have to hold sending them in, but we'll hold on answering them until the end. But please do go ahead and send us your questions. We're really excited to hear from you guys too. So with that, welcome to the Decarbonization Pathways for Existing Buildings in Los Angeles session this afternoon of MGBCE 2021. These are our learning objectives. And I'm not going to spend time going through all of them because we do have a lot of content to cover, but please take a look and make sure that this is something that looks like it would be useful for you to attend. And since we are sitting here in a virtual environment, I wanted to introduce to you our speakers. We have here Erin McConahey, who's an ARUP fellow and a principal with ARUP in our Los Angeles office. I am Seth Strongin. I'm an associate and the Energy and Sustainability Discipline Leader for ARUP in our Los Angeles office. And we're going to be presenting to you today a lot of the research that we've been doing, and we've recently published in a report called the Zero Carbon Collaboration, The Case for Los Angeles. This has been a research endeavor that Erin, myself, and many others have been working on within ARUP have been working on for the last year or so. And I've posted here the URL that you can access the report. I recognize it's a little bit of a mouthful, so I've also posted our email addresses, and you could feel free to reach out to either one of us. This report is available for free for download online, and will contain a lot of the more detailed results of what we're going to go through here today. So I probably don't need to preach too much to the choir here about why it's important that we take action on the climate. We know that the 10 hottest years on record have all happened within the last decade and a half, and we know that the last 5 years have been the hottest 5 years on record. You've also probably seen these historic graphing of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, and you can see that whereas historically it has been closer to 300 parts per million, we're now well above the 400 parts per million. And we know that the time for climate action is now. So what does that mean for us here in Los Angeles? We at ARUP were lucky enough to get to partner with Mayor Garcetti and provide the technical analysis in LA's Green New Deal. A key part of that project was to develop pathways for the city of Los Angeles to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. You can see here, this graph on the right is the GHG emission trajectories and how we're going to reduce those. And you can see through this purple line at the bottom, this is the building energy use. And as you can see, this is by far the largest GHG emissions sector within the city of Los Angeles right now. So the need to decarbonize our building stock is apparent. And so within this work that we did with the Green New Deal, we tried to come up with some goals that would help to reduce the GHG emissions from the building stock. We established 2 key goals that are foundational to the research that we're going to share with you today. Those 2 goals are to reduce building energy usage, total energy usage, citywide, 22% by 2025, 35% by 2035, and 44% by 2050. We also set a goal that 100% of buildings, including all existing buildings, will be net zero carbon in the city of Los Angeles by 2050. And while we know that the need to take action on the climate is apparent, there's also many co-benefits of decarbonizing our buildings. So you can see here that there's benefits that accrue to equity in terms of reducing energy poverty, improving indoor safety, and local both indoor and ambient air quality improvements. There's economic opportunities through workforce development and quality jobs. And of course, there's the environmental benefits of the climate mitigation as well as additional resilience factors. We also know that decarbonization is rooted in several other major sustainability frameworks, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Erin is going to discuss a little bit later in the presentation exactly where this building decarbonization, how it's affecting these sustainable development goals. But we know that these actions are not going to happen in a vacuum. So when we think about building decarbonization, we really think about it as a three-part strategy. One is to decarbonize the source of electricity. That is the electricity that we get from the grid to be supplied through carbon-free resources. A second is energy efficiency. This is bringing down the total energy demand or the energy loads that must be met through clean energy. The third is to electrify. So if we are going to be able to get our electricity source off of being supplied by fossil fuels, then we need to be able to be powering our buildings with clean energy. So that means eliminating the need for combustion on site. So this three-part strategy taken together will help is the pathway that we'll use to achieve building decarbonization. So we are very lucky here in the city of Los Angeles that we have a very progressive utility, and our friends in LADWP, as you may have heard earlier today and have heard in the news recently, have charted out a path for us to achieve 100% carbon-free electricity grid by 2045. This is in part coming out of the goals that we set in the Green New Deal to gradually increase the percentage of the grid that is supplied by carbon-free electricity from about 33% now to about 50 to 55% in 2025, 80% in 2036, and 100% by 2045. We also know that's undergirded by the SB 100 Renewable Portfolio Standard requirements, which require that 100% of the electricity grid in the entire state of California will be supplied by carbon-free energy by 2045. And the recent LA 100 roadmap study showed the roadmap for exactly how LA is going to do this. But for those of you who were watching the Mayor Garcetti in the last few weeks at the State of the City address, he accelerated that timeline by an additional 10 years, setting a goal for us to achieve 100% carbon-free grid here in Los Angeles by 2035. I will note that as I mentioned in the beginning, we've been working on this project for quite some time, and the 2035 announcement came out when we were deep into the publication process and had already run much of the analysis. So perhaps that will be a phase 2 or a next presentation for us to do. But today's research, what we're going to present, is based on a 100% clean grid by 2045, as opposed to the recently announced 2035 goal. And here you can see with these various goals that have been set out in the Green New Deal, how we can get to this net zero carbon goal through the convergence of these goals. We really need to be working on all three sides, with energy reduction and electrification, as well as greening of the grid. And that, by using that three-part strategy, that is how we can achieve carbon neutrality in our building sector. So again, going back to this three-part strategy, they're all interdependent on each other. As you can see from this diagram, they are not standalone bubbles, but they are all connected to each other. We're very lucky here in Los Angeles that our friends at LADWP are working very hard on decarbonizing our electricity. So our study today is going to focus mostly on energy efficiency and electrification. So we had to set out and figure out what it was we were trying to specifically figure out, how we were going to get to optimizing the way for buildings to decarbonize. And we had 5 key research questions. 1, which energy conservation measures are the best investment? 2, which is better for electrification? heat pumps or electric resistance technology? 3, are there benefits to early electrification? 4, which zero carbon path best meets the LA Green New Deal's reduction targets? And perhaps the question that underlies all of these is, what will it cost? Because we know that having the goodwill to make these changes, or knowing that they need to be made, is not going to be enough. There are real world impacts, and we have to find the right way that is going to make sure that the benefits and the costs are balanced in a way that it's not undue burdens on anyone else. So how did we do this? We wanted to understand what a representative sample of buildings was in Los Angeles so that we could develop these optimized pathways for decarbonization. We thought that a good place to start was the city's existing building energy and water efficiency ordinance, sometimes known as EBEW. So within there, what we wanted to do was understand the characteristics of the building stock. We know that the EBEW ordinance applies to private buildings that are over 20,000 square feet and applies to municipal buildings that are over 15,000 square feet. So we took a look at all of the buildings that are subject to EBEW, and we found a very striking pattern. We saw that there was 2 predominant building types: multifamily housing and commercial office space. And we knew that this was where we should really focus our attention. As you can see, it's a dramatically more square footage of these buildings than any other buildings within the city that are subject to this ordinance. So then we needed to set out and to actually analyze buildings. So we didn't have a specific building that we were working on, so we needed to look at a representative sample. So again, we took our commercial and we took our multifamily, and we had to come up with a sample building that represented these. So we turned to the US Department of Energy and the Pacific Northwest National Labs commercial reference buildings. These are building models that are building prototypes that were developed by the federal government, really for this exact purpose, so that you could test different interventions. They're the basis of many standards that we've come to rely on, and many rating systems, including LEED and other rating systems, use either these standards or these buildings directly. And one of the things that was also appealing to us about the commercial buildings, about the commercial reference buildings, was that they're specifically designed to be powered on the Energy Plus energy modeling engine. This is an open source software. So what that allowed us to do was to add automation. You can imagine, as we unfold the results here, we ran over 2,000 simulations of various energy models. To have to build those and run all of those manually would have taken an inordinate amount of time. So we used Python scripting to automate that process and tie it into the Energy Plus so that we could just pull information from a database and automatically run these energy models to get rapid results. We also wanted to take a look at impacts over time. As you'll see, we believe that the best pathway is to implement ECMs in sequence. And so we wanted to look at over time how this would shift. And so we used a tool that Erin helped develop called Weather Shift, which allows us to model future climate conditions so that we're not so that we're looking at how buildings will perform based on what we anticipate the climate to be at the time that we're looking at them. So I mentioned that we used the Department of Energy and Pacific Northwest National Lab prototype building models. So just quickly, for a large commercial office, that is approximately a 500,000 square foot building consisting of 12 stories, and the envelope and HVAC systems and other building characteristics, they're all going to vary by vintage, which I'll get to in a second. On the multifamily side, the best fit that we found was a 33,000 square foot, 4-story, 32-unit building. And again, the envelope, systems, and equipment within the building will vary by the vintage. So what we wanted to do was test a series of energy conservation measures and electrification options. And we wanted to look at these with our different building types, in our different vintages of buildings, and then we wanted to look at different sequences of implementing the energy conservation measures and electrification options. Now, what you're looking at here is the packages of the ECMs and electrification options that we put together. I'm not going to go through all of the individual ECMs, but we tried to group things together based on the concept that if you're going to make a lighting upgrade, you're going to go ahead and make a full lighting upgrade all at the same time. Or if you're going to replace HVAC systems, you're going to go ahead and do a comprehensive retrofit and not just do those piecemeal over time. So we put those together in these packages. As you can see, there's 5 discrete packages for each of the building types that deal with HVAC systems. They deal with the efficiency of equipment, appliances, and lighting. And the packages are customized to each of the building types. So we know that we know that the types of energy conservation measures and electrification options that might be applicable in a multifamily environment may not be the same or are not the same as those in a commercial environment. So we really tried to develop these to be specific to the usage type and to be realistic for the type of retrofits that can happen and that are going to make an impact. I've mentioned a few times now that we also use this concept of building vintages. So if you think about it, you would not expect a building that was built in the 1980s to perform the same as a building that is built to today's standards. So likewise, we wouldn't expect that if we're going to implement energy conservation measures and electrification options, that those would behave the same in buildings from different eras. We're very lucky here in California to have a robust statewide energy code, the Title 24, Part 6. Now, this code has been on the books since 1978, and we know that now it gets updated every 3 years. Over its 40 some odd year history, it has not always been in quite such neat packages, but it does get updated every few years. And so we were able to use that to establish what the building features in terms of the required equipment and efficiencies would likely be for the buildings of those vintages. So we know that if the code in the 1990s was pushing us towards certain types of HVAC systems, that is likely to be what is implemented in a building of a 1990s vintage. So with that in mind, we developed 6 different vintages of buildings that we were looking at. One was for buildings built effectively before there was a Title 24, so those before the 1980s. And then from there, we've taken a look at each subsequent decade. So we looked at buildings in the 1980s based on the idea that what the code said in 1978, it would take a few years to build those buildings. And then the buildings that were actually constructed and occupied in the 1980s are representative of that code just at the end of the last decade. So we have vintages from pre-1980s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, and current buildings. And then you'll see along the timeline that we're also looking into the future. Again, it'd be great to make all of these retrofits tomorrow, but we know that there are real world implications, and we wanted to take a look at different pathways for implementing them, including early pathways, midterm pathways, and late-term pathways for implementing these ECMs. So we took a look at those over time. And to that point, we had 4 different scenarios that we really focused on. One was an early electrification pathway, but with electric resistance technology. A second was that same early electrification pathway, but using heat pumps instead of electric resistance. And then we looked at midterm electrification, also using heat pumps, and then late electrification to see if there was benefits, costs, benefits, advantages, disadvantages to going one way or another. And advantages and disadvantages can be different depending on who's looking at them. So there's benefits in terms of carbon emissions. There's also impacts such as cost and how those could possibly be passed on to others. So we wanted to really be careful about how we were looking at all of these over time. And likewise, we did the same with the multifamily. 4 different, similar 4 scenarios, looking at just at different points in time to see what different impacts we would have. So we feel that it is possible to reach zero carbon, and the time for climate action is now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin to share the results of our research.
Thank you, Seth. So we'll get going with the commercial office spaces. Those are really the high potential properties within the city. And you'll see why in just a second. So the first thing that we did, there we go. The first thing that we did was we looked at the original list of ECMs. The original list of ECMs did include building envelope upgrades, roof insulation, bringing it up to the current code. And what you can see up on the screen is for each of the vintages, there's a different colored line for each of the ECMs. So you can see by far the lighting upgrades were like really providing the greatest EUI or energy use intensity reductions. So it's percent reduction in EUI across the bottom, and then just the ECMs with their little vintage clusters. What you can see down at the bottom is that really, you know, the building envelope was all of the 4 ECMs that we were looking at for building envelope. They weren't really getting us that much percent EUI reduction, and some of them were even causing a negative EUI reduction. And the roof insulation way up at the top, it really wasn't gaining us sort of very much. And that's, you know, specific to Los Angeles climate. You wouldn't get these types of results related to building envelope if you were in a colder climate. But we were doing the study just for Los Angeles, so it's applicable there. So, but it's not just about how much, you know, energy reduction something's able to get. You know, buildings are investments for the people who own them. And when we're talking about which ECMs are the best investment, you have to compare kind of what your return on investment is. And so this graph here is basically plotting the energy use intensity percentage savings across the y-axis versus the simple payback, right? And so you can see the roof insulations way on the left, down at 0. Your lighting upgrades have a really quick payback period because they have a high EUI and they have reasonable costs. All the envelope modifications kind of fell out to the right side above 25 years. So we can really see by plotting the information this way where we should be investing, which are the ECMs that really make sense to make into those packages that Seth was talking about previously. And so, you know, as Seth said, one of the questions that we were always asking ourselves is, you know, well, what's best to do, heat pumps or electric resistance? Now, what I'll say in advance is it's very contingent on what's happening at your own building, because sometimes there's just like physical configurations that it's going to be easier to pop an electric resistance boiler right in the place where that old gas boiler was, instead of, you know, repiping everything and trying to get kind of a heat pump system to work. However, if you're looking just from an energy point of view, you know, the heat pump systems in our particular climate are definitely, you know, sort of beneficial for 2 reasons. Number one, the first cost is tending to be lower because obviously you're essentially replacing the chiller and giving it the capability to create heating at the same time. Whereas when you're doing electric resistance, you're also often having to upgrade the electrical infrastructure to take that higher kW, kilowatt sort of demand off of that new piece of electric resistance equipment. And so what we found when we looked at the 25-year energy savings, so if you did an early electrification, say, you would have a 25-year tail of energy savings that was accruing because you did that electrification move. And so what we saw was that, you know, for the older buildings, you know, before 1990, even up to before 2000s, you know, you're in striking range of being able to recover the cost of doing that change and investing and applying these packages. As you get closer to the current time after the 2000s, it's really much harder. And you can see definitely the differential between the heat pumps versus the electric resistance. So are there benefits to early electrification? Yes. If there are definitely benefits if you take advantage of that 25-year energy savings, especially for those buildings that are built before 2010, and especially for the heat pump conversions. You know, the other benefits is that you might be hedging against rising costs of natural gas as maybe demand falls over time. You may be stabilizing your electricity costs during the rate increases that it's going to take for LADWP to do the grid conversion up until 2035. And you may be avoiding some escalation of first cost of these pieces of equipment as, you know, kind of demand grows. You will tend to lower your carbon emissions to assist with your ESG reporting for scopes 1 and 2 for sure. And then also for scope 3, because some of your heat is going, especially in the heat pump options, some of your heat is going to create heating on the site instead of all of your heat rejection going out through cooling tower water, which tends to be falling into scope 3 emissions. Now, one thing I do want to mention about the commercial office buildings, there are currently 0 or near 0 GWP, global warming potential, refrigerants already in use on large chiller equipment. So these types of large equipment are ready to go from a refrigerant point of view and aren't subject to being some future phase out of equipment and not having the right equipment to be able to do these changes. So the other question that Seth was raising was, which of these 4 electrification paths best meets the Green New Deal? So we did test them. We did a bunch of energy modeling to test what would happen if you did each of those steps in that particular order in each of the next 3 decades. Again, thinking that most owners would either be wanting to smooth out their cash flow versus benefits, as well as, you know, some of this equipment just needs to wait to the end of its life in order to be replaced. Nobody's going to go and just rip out a new chiller just because it seems like there's benefits, because really then you have lost all the cost of the sunk asset. So what you can see here, the dotted green line is essentially the Green New Deal targets that Seth showed you that come from that document. And for the old buildings before 1990, you can see that all 4 of the paths are able to kind of stay below that Green New Deal target. Sometimes people ask me, so why does EUI go up after the 2030s? Well, that's because of that weather shift file. We do have a climate shifted weather file that we run for 2045, which is obviously more extreme. Everybody's always talking about, you know, 2 degrees C rise by mid-century. Well, that's what that is referring to. And when it's hotter outside, it's going to put more load onto all of your chiller systems. Yeah. Now, the thing that we need to remember, especially if we've decarbonized the grid by 2035, the carbon for this building is going to collapse and basically drop down to 0 once your electrification has completed. So EUI is not the only story, but we're just showing it to you to be able to show you against the Green New Deal. So, but when we look at around the buildings built in the 2000s decade, you can see it's a little tighter. You know, you started with a lower beginning point of EUI just because of how the code had already improved by that time. And you can see that most of them are kind of hovering in and out around the Green New Deal targets, with maybe just that early electric resistance just popping up just a tad at the end. As you get closer into, you know, buildings that have been built in maybe the last 5 years or so, you can see that you start to get some greater diversion up at the end for that early electric resistance if you chose to go down that path, right? So, you know, there is energy savings still being accrued across that 25-year period, across a 5-year period. So, you know, if there was to be an ordinance that required you to meet the Green New Deal targets, you know, you could pay, you know, $730,000 for 5 years worth of green power to bring that back down, or on-site PV, right? And so, you know, as some kind of building decarbonization ordinance comes out, perhaps, you know, alternate pathways for compliance on GHG reductions might be recommended for these younger buildings that couldn't do it necessarily by buying super expensive equipment to try to force down their carbon emissions. So what will it cost? So the thing that we always have to remind ourselves is, especially for the systems that we're talking about, these pieces of equipment are going to come to the end of their life and they are going to have to be replaced. So the only thing that we should really be looking at is the differential cost between the upgrade and what it would have cost to just replace like for like. And what we can see is for all those older buildings up until the 2000s, you know, basically it's a cost savings in order to be able to do that upgrade because they're already ready for it. Whereas these late, you know, the last 10 years or so, you know, those are really having, sort of a much more difficult sort of return on investment argument to do any form of early electrification. So our recommendations would be, anything that is built before 2010 to consider doing an early upgrade during the 2020 decade in order to reap the benefits of the energy savings and to help with decarbonization in the city. And then for those buildings that have been built in the last 10 years, you still have a good viable set of equipment. So consider upgrading at the end of life to heat pumps. Now, we said that there's a lot of potential in the commercial sector. In the multifamily sector, there's actually quite a lot of need. We know the situation with regards to housing and affordable housing. So this is definitely something that sort of might exacerbate the situation. So we all want to be conscious of that. The trends are very similar to what we saw. The lighting and the appliance upgrades definitely are the winners on energy use reductions. The roof insulation still not come into play. The building envelope, having some, especially before 1990, before we really got much better building envelopes and especially glazing in the 1990s. The trends are kind of what we have seen before. One key thing is, the heat pump conversions here, because they are kind of like, at that packaged unit kind of equipment level, there's much more difficulty proving them out as saving you energy as compared to larger chiller plant systems. So again, you've seen this before under the commercial. We plot the simple payback versus the energy use intensity, and we can see that it's really the heat pump water heaters, maybe some window upgrades if you can get enough money to help you with this 22, 23-year payback period, the lighting upgrades. And we would point out that we need to convert to heat pump HVAC packaged units, even though they are not having a good payback, because they do use slightly more energy than the equivalent cooling only systems. So again, you can see, just like we saw with the commercial, but unlike with the commercial, these bars for the estimated 25-year savings are nowhere close to the first costs here. The other thing that is an issue for multifamily is that most multifamily properties have meters on electricity for the apartments, and it's the apartment dwellers or tenants who are paying the bills. Whereas the majority of the first cost is actually in the electrical upgrade of the infrastructure, because as we add all of this extra electric load to replace the gas appliances, that infrastructure, that panel has to increase in amperage, and that is something that accrues to the owner, and yet the energy efficiency benefits don't accrue to the owner. And what we found was that purely the cost of the electrical infrastructure upgrade itself is almost 30% of this cost of the first cost. So that is something that we will have to face if we want to get all of our properties to be able to convert. So are there benefits to early electrification? The short answer is no. You could do it at any time, because you don't have that benefit necessarily of the 25-year savings to pay it off. However, we think that it's still beneficial to do some preparatory work. LED lighting upgrades is positive if you can get some weatherization grants as some of this federal funding coming up. Definitely, that's something to consider, especially for eligible properties such as HUD housing. We're hearing that some of that funding will be available for kind of weatherization grants. We would note, unlike the commercial side, refrigerants for the residential scale are still using HFCs. HFCs are being phased down. There's just an announcement about 3 weeks ago that the US has committed to that through Congress and the Biden administration. So there are near zero GWP refrigerants that are being used internationally. They aren't quite approved in the United States yet, and FPA and ASHRAE are working on that. So there are some other reasons to possibly delay on some of those heat pump conversions during at least the next few years here until we have a better insight there. We already spoke about the electrical backbone upgrade sort of issues. So again, which path meets the Green New Deal targets? Same exercises before, and we're seeing the similar trends. You know, things swing a little bit more just because the buildings are smaller. But you know, before 1990, people swing one way or another around the Green New Deal target, but end up pretty much right on it at the end. So again, are there pathways to allow people, alternate pathways to show compliance, or do we defer, given the extraordinary cost to the multifamily property owner, do we defer the need, if you do early electrification, to also have to bring your EUIs down to the Green New Deal targets? That's something that policymakers will have to decide, and decide whether even the Green New Deal targets are something that they want to apply at a property level. For the 2000s, we're seeing the same, although with the popping up above at the end, but you know, still in the realm of like kind of hovering on one side or the other of the new Green Deal targets. And then similarly, what we saw before in the late 2000s, definitely exceedances at a couple key locations. And so again, you know, we had done some analysis to just look at, well, you do have some energy savings. In this case, this particular case is, you know, $40,000 to $50,000 energy savings, and that's balanced by, you know, the extra cost of maybe $80,000 worth of 25 years of WP green power, or maybe $80,000 of on-site PV in order to cover you on that. So these are just the kind of ways that we were sort of looking at this. How could the properties help the cause, and what can be done on the property versus off property? Same analysis before. You know, we see these you know, differential costs, simple paybacks being very, very long paybacks. So these are not usually something that a property owner would see as return on investment at 20 or 40 years. We would also point out that these older buildings would be having, you know, R22, which was already being on the process of being phased out. And then these upper ones up here with the newer refrigerant, which will be phased out during this decade. So there's really not a differential in terms of age of building that makes the recommendation here. Really, we have to wait for the market to catch up for the right low GWP refrigerants to be available in the converted equipment, and that's just because we don't want to be putting equipment in that has the risk of adding to carbon equivalent emissions through high GWP refrigerants. So the only other thing that I wanted to really speak to here is, you know, we really need to act together. We can reach zero carbon. You kind of see this map sort of at the macro level. It has to devolve down to the property level as well. Why are we talking about that three-part approach? It's because we really need to have on-site demand balance. It's the savings in peak kW from energy efficiency that basically gives enough room on the electrical infrastructure at the property to take that hit in increased kW that comes from electrifying gas appliances. And the more that we can hold that balance within the property line, it means that LADWP can focus their efforts on decarbonizing the electrical power source and not have to be ripping up, you know, streets in order to be able to bring increased demand throughout the city. So I often joke, even if the energy, you know, savings doesn't convince you, just the traffic disruption in the city, you know, maybe that'll convince people to help with this sort of on-site balance as we go forward with the decarbonization effort. And so what you can see is in most cases, even for the electric resistance packages, the orange line is where you're starting with your PKW. Will go up with the KW associated with the electrification. But, you know, the energy efficiency is this kind of white bar, which is kind of the negative space. And so across the top, you can see that net, it's mostly negative up until maybe the stuff that's getting built right now, for the commercial office. And then similarly for the multifamily, it's netting out at negative on the KW balance, except for stuff that's been built in the last 5 years, or the stuff that may be going in right now under the current code that's already in construction. But these are small KWs, and we know that sort of more modern sort of infrastructure is typically the NEC code is conservative, and there is spare power in most of these connections for these more modern buildings. So in addition to that sort of collaboration between kind of contain the KW peaks at the site, we called our report Zero Carbon Collaboration because we see that this is a great collaboration for the city and for the state. So what we saw was there's essentially collaboration from the state to encourage, through legislation, the utilities actually taking action. LADWP has been a forerunner within the state with regards to that. And as that happens, we believe that green financing will start to be made available for the city because they'll be able to trust that the utility is taking the right actions. And so then that, and we do need to understand that there's a great burden that's going to be put onto LADWP because there's a lot of gas-based appliances that will be moving over. So the inner ring here is representing the utility usage split as reported by UCLA, LA Energy Atlas. Multifamily has 62% of annual energy use in the city is based on gas utilities, and for office buildings, it's 38%. So all of that sort of orange needs to become red in order for us to drop the Scope 1 carbon elimination. And so really the buildings are the fourth gear that needs to come into play. So, what does it take for, sort of governmental encouragement to not only be driving the utilities, but also to be driving the conversion of our building stock. And as we all work together, just like is shown with these gears, kind of working, all rotating in the right way to self-reinforce with each other, how we can all work together to hold up our part in order to decarbonize our city. So here's the provocation. Are we willing to think about building decarbonization ordinance? Are we willing to think about a transparent LADWP rate trajectory that will increase confidence in the investor market and the building owners in knowing how to predict what their return on investment is? Can we encourage building owners to start doing building assessments and upgrade strategies? And will all of that unlock green financing and block grants to allow an accelerated conversion in our city? So the key findings, it's possible to get there through currently available technology and 100% renewable electric. If you're an older office building, the 25-year savings do help to cover your first cost. For younger buildings, except for the youngest buildings, on-site KW balance is possible. For the multifamily residential, we do believe that possibly conversion grants or loans are likely to be needed. And then for buildings that are built within the last 10 years or have already had retrofits, might need alternate pathways if Green New Deal's intentions are to be applied at the property level. So last but not least, we do want to say that all this needs to happen in a way that leaves no one behind. Seth spoke of the UN SDGs, and this is really kind of how we see this. It starts with the goal of affordable and clean energy, SDG 7, and LADWP already has an expedited plan to deliver that. Building off of that, what are we hoping to get out of that? Well, by not having fossil fuel-based power plants within the city, that should help to improve health. And by having a move to renewable energies that has free fuel, eventually we should be able to help to reduce energy poverty by building the smallest clean grid possible. We do have to plan to avoid passing on upgrade costs to low-income renters because it's already difficult enough, as we all know, especially after the last year. So building owners are really critical as part of the partnership for the goals. Owners are critical to upgrading their building stock to help hold the green grid conversion costs and therefore rates as low as possible. So that's about that responsible production, consumption of energy and the production of how they're going to operate their buildings. And then last but not least, and this really is the case for Los Angeles, that's embedded at the heart of the Green New Deal, is that along the way, we'll be able to produce decent work and economic growth to achieve our being a sustainable carbon-free community that meets our commitments to climate action. So thank you very much for your time today. We love to address your questions. And I think we do have about 5 minutes left for questions here.
Yes, great. And there's several questions that have come in. I did want to point out that Erin had posted in the chat on Zoom a link to the report, and then I posted it in the Wahoo app. So please do go ahead and download that. And like we said, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to walk through any of the findings in further detail, or send you a link if these links don't work. But I'm going to go ahead and go through some questions here. Our first question comes from Greg Collins. He asks, do envelope upgrades assume they happen when systems components require replacement, similar to what was mentioned about HVAC systems? Well, I could take that first question. The envelope upgrades were not necessarily assuming an end of useful life in quite the same way that HVAC systems were. So we looked at those just in regards to making envelope upgrades, although we did look at them packaged together so that we could minimize disruption. But also, as Erin said, while we didn't find tremendously impactful energy reductions as a result of that, we do feel that that is largely based on our, very pleasant, temperate climate here in Los Angeles. And so, this presentation and this research is specific to Los Angeles in the sense that we were using LA climate data, but we feel that it is applicable really anywhere as long as you plug the appropriate climate data in. And as Erin said, we would suspect that in many places, even within the United States, but certainly globally, that we would see a much greater impact from envelope. We're fortunate to have such good weather here in LA. Okay, next question comes from Kate Diamond. Hi, Kate. The question is, did the study look primarily at high-rise commercial buildings, i.e. with relatively small roof area and relatively large wall area? Would the consideration of low mid-rise buildings change the impact of envelope enhancements?
Yeah, so again, we were looking at buildings that were above 20,000 square feet, and one of the things that we did note that it would be good to look at those smaller mid-rise office buildings, because we did jump to the DOE's sort of large office, which is 12-story and almost 500,000 square feet. So I think that, yeah, the more envelope you have, the more it influences the approach. Although having said that, when we looked at the multifamily, when you compare it on a return on investment, because envelope retrofits are so costly, I would think that commercial office would have even less return on investment than multifamily at that smaller scale. So I think that that's why they kind of fell off of the analysis, because they just didn't have a return on investment that we thought was feasible without significant additional grants or other money. I would say at the multifamily level, people might still do it for comfort reasons, from a resilience point of view or other reasons. But when you look purely at energy, and that was sort of our criteria when we were looking at this cost of energy, the return on investments alone were not there. So I wouldn't think they would be there for small commercial either.
Okay, next question is from Erin Ordauer. Erin asks, did you payback analysis assume you were replacing at the end of useful life? And if so, are the paybacks based on comparison with conventional replacements?
So we did cost models for like replacements versus the upgraded replacement. And so all of those graphs where I showed that was the package differential cost or the cost effectiveness, those were all based on the differentials, which really is the only added cost of the upgrade.
Great. The next is actually not a question, but I think it's a worthy comment to put forward to the group. Also from Greg, saying it would be great to turn some of these findings into a comparison or an infographic comparing gas boilers versus electric resistance boilers versus heat pumps for space heating in today's new construction designs. So yeah, no, we agree, and we think that there's a lot of opportunity to show different cost or different comparisons. There's many different ways to slice this up. One challenge, and I would sort of put this out to everyone because it's something that we experienced, is that there's so much data that comes out of these analyses that the question becomes, what is the most useful, and what is going to be able to be turned into action. And so we love getting suggestions like this, and I think that's a worthy one for us to look at for the future. So thanks for that suggestion, Greg. Next question, another one from Erin asks, when you talk about heat pumps for commercial and multifamily buildings, are you talking about mini splits, VRF, some other application? Does it include domestic hot water?
Yes. So in the commercial, the heat pumps were serving both heating hot water and generating domestic hot water with a little bit of electric resistant boost. And then in the multifamily, it was definitely the domestic hot water and then the conversion of packaged units.
Great. We've got lots of people who are very interested and have multiple comments. So we have another one here from Kate, which is both comment and question. Erin, your insights on multifamily are definitely depressing me. We need to think about subsidy strategies that would change the equation to modify the incentives and make it worthwhile for property owners to electrify sooner rather than later. Also to note that consistent carrot and stick incentives and code mandates have also led to both systems innovations and reduced cost of equipment production. Trying to be an optimist? Thank you for the kind words, Kate. So
yeah,
look,
it's one of the findings that surprised us, and one of the reasons why we wanted to highlight that. It is very concerning to us, especially given the homeless situation in the city, the issues with affordable housing. We really have to manage this as a whole community, which is why we so heavily stress this zero carbon collaboration. It will take activating green financing. It will take understanding the true benefits that are accruing to the commercial sector and seeing how much of, I'm not a policymaker, but how much of that can help, to convert the multifamily, because the commercial sector won't exist if the people can't live here to serve it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons to do the research like this, is to understand that we need to develop some policy mechanisms and we need to develop some support systems. And you're right, Kate, we don't have those in place yet. And we, as Erin said, that's where the collaboration comes in. We need lots of stakeholders at the table for this. And so hopefully this research can help to lay some of that foundation, but this is a starting point for us, and is a launching pad rather than a destination, I think.
So we are going to get cut off in 1 minute. So
I think there is one last comment in here as we are about to get cut off, and I think it is a very important one. Jan Dietrich says, the health impacts of cooking with gas are so big, the asthma in children, that it seems like an equity goal should be to help residents buy single or double portable induction cooktops that could cut use of a gas burner by more than half. Well, we certainly agree that there are significant health impacts and indoor environmental quality considerations. And I think that is, one of the challenges here is sometimes it's hard to quantify those, or they're quite morbid putting those into statistics, but those are very, very real concerns. And it's even further, speaking to Kate's point and how we responded to it, that this is the need for collaboration. This is why we need to have lots of different people with lots of different perspectives all putting their heads together to solve these problems, because these issues may not show up on a balance sheet, but they sure are real problems that we need to address.
And with that, we thank you for your time today and all of the great questions. Feel free to reach out to us to continue the dialogue, and have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, enjoy your conference. Thanks, everyone.